Welcome to A Guide to Every Deck in Legacy. Today we're looking at 8-Cast. 8-Cast is a blue Artifacts Matter deck that plays numerous cheap artifacts and affinity-style payoffs for them. To go over the payoffs first, Kappa Cannoneer is perhaps the most important piece of the deck, being a huge threat that comes down cheap due to Improvise, is hard to remove if it resolves due to Ward 4, and can't be blocked. Emry can easily be cast on turn 1, is primarily used to draw an extra card every turn by looping Mishra's and Urza's Baubles. However, it's not limited to just those two and can do other things like adding mana with Lotus Petal or Mox Opal, or recurring Aether Spellbomb every turn as repeatable removal. Sai is a value engine that tacks Create a Thopter token onto the text of every artifact and can also draw cards by sacrificing excess artifacts. Thoughtcast and Thought Monitor, the two cards from which the deck gets the name 8-Cast, are card drawing payoffs for playing the numerous cheap artifacts in the deck. Finally, Urza's Saga provides large construct tokens as beaters and can tutor for most artifacts in the deck. Now, moving on to the enablers. The deck plays numerous cheap artifacts, most costing 0 mana, to set up the aforementioned cards. Mishra's and Urza's Bauble replace themselves and, as previously stated, are good targets for Emry. Mox Opal and Lotus Petal provide a quick burst of ramp. Chalice of the Void is always a strong card in Legacy and is great in this deck since few cards cost 1, and those that do can be cheated through it via Saga. It can also be played on turn 1 using Petal, Opal, or Ancient Tomb. Outside of Chalice, Force of Will serves as one of the deck's few pieces of interaction. Lastly are tutor targets for Saga, which include cards like Aether Spellbomb, Pithing Needle, and Shadow Spear. Sideboarding and Weaknesses. Being a heavy artifact deck, 8-Cast is obviously weak to artifact hate, and Legacy has some extremely strong hate. Meltdown, Seeds of Innocence, and Serenity are all cheap cards that easily blow away most of your board. Stony Silence and Null Rod are incredibly effective and basically completely shut down the deck. A lot of the sideboard can be tech to fight hate cards or just opposing combo decks with spells like Force of Negation and Metallic Rebuke. Otawara is also an important card for fighting permanent-based hate. Dismember, Brazen Borrower, or other removal spells fight creatures such as Delver. Graveyard Hate is of course a must and takes the usual forms of cards like Soul Guide Lantern and Grafdigger's Cage. Cage also hits various creature cheats like Natural Order and Green Sun Zenith. It's also important to note that Cage shuts off your own Emrys. Hurkyl's Recall can fight opposing artifact decks or bounce your own board, more on that later. It's important to keep in mind for Force of Will and Negation that only about 1/3 of the deck's cards are blue. On a similar note, the deck plays few lands and only contains roughly 12 mana sources that produce blue, or 16 if you count Lotus Petal. Tips and tricks. Emry loops Baubles to draw extra cards, can cycle Petal and Mox for mana, returns destroyed Chalices or Thought Monitors, repeatedly brings back Spellbomb, Soul Guide Lantern, and so on. Basically, she's great with any artifact that can be sacrificed to produce value and recurs things that have died to removal. It can be correct to delay playing cheap artifacts early for Sai. For example, if you have numerous 0 mana artifacts, you can play Sai off Ancient Tomb or a single Lotus Petal, then follow up by dumping your hand, generating tons of Thopters. Sai's sacrifice ability can be used to recycle dud artifacts into more cards. For example, Superfluous Chalices after the first one, extra copies of Mox Opal, Seed of the Synod later in the game when you don't need the mana anymore, etc. If you want to change the number of counters on Chalice for some reason, you can sacrifice it to Sai and bring it back with Emry. Because Sai generates artifact Thopter tokens, any artifact played when he's out counts as a de facto Lotus Petal for affinity type cards like Thoughtcast, Thought Monitor, and Kappa Cannoneer. Kappa Cannoneer triggers from any of your artifacts entering the battlefield, including itself, meaning it will always be at least a 5/5. If you're low on artifacts, you can withhold playing one to ensure Cannoneer is unblockable on your next turn. It's important to know what number to name with Chalice of the Void. It'll usually be 1, but there are cases where you'll want a different number. Bounce effects like Aether Spellbomb and Otawara can reuse your own cast and ETB triggers, primarily Thought Monitor, but you can also get another Thopter with Sai, another counter on Cannoneer, mill 4 more with Emry, etc. Speaking of, you can float mana and bounce most of your board with Hurkyl's Recall, then replay everything, which is very good with Sai. You can also save important cards from removal if you have to. Remember that Otawara's activation cost is reduced by Emry and Sai, and by 2 if you have both. Your opponent must activate anything they want with an activated ability before you sacrifice Saga to tutor for Pithing Needle. They can't wait and see what you get, since once Needle's in play, it's too late. I hope you've enjoyed this look at 8-Cast. I want to thank my fellow players in the Magic community for whom sharing their experiences helps make these guides possible. You can find additional resources, such as an up-to-date deck list, in the description. If you think I left out anything important or got something wrong, please leave your thoughts in the comments, and stay tuned to see what deck we look at next time.